Welcome to First But Last, brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. I am your host, Emmy DeGrappa. Wyoming is called the Equality State because we were the first to give women the right to vote. 150 years later, we wonder what Wyoming women think about the progress toward equality now. Let's find out, and thank you for listening. Today, we are talking to Diane Shober, Executive Director of the Wyoming Office of Tourism. Diane is a nationally recognized tourism leader. She is engaged in state and federal initiatives centered on progress, innovation, and growth. Welcome, Diane.
Thank you.
Where did you grow up, Diane?
I grew up in Gillette, Wyoming.
Oh, okay. And then you went to the University of Wyoming, and then you ran away to Chicago, right?
Well, that is kind of the path I took. I grew up in Gillette and then went to school at the University of Wyoming, graduated the University of Wyoming with a degree in marketing. Then I took a summer and went to the United Kingdom and went to summer school at the University of Manchester in Manchester, England, and then headed to Denver, went back to Wyoming, back to Gillette and worked. And then in 1993, I took off and went to Chicago. And fortunately, in 2003, I came back to Wyoming.
Right. And so I was going to ask you, so you spent a significant amount in Chicago, right? Working in the tourism industry.
I did. It was such a great experience for me, Emmy. You know, I went from this regional local exposure in Wyoming. I had lived in Denver, but I had never been to a major city. And so from the tourism marketing experience, but also the cultural opportunities and just the expansion of rubbing elbows with people of all ages and backgrounds and connections. And it was really a wonderful experience. And, you know, when you work for the Chicago Convention and Visitors Bureau and you're with this world-class city, you know, the learning there was exponential in terms of what I was able to garner on a full global scale of marketing.
And so when you decided to return to Wyoming, it was to take on this job as the executive director of Wyoming Tourism.
That's correct. I had some friends still. Obviously, my family has always been in Wyoming. So even during those years when I was in Chicago, I was, coming back frequently and people were coming to visit me. And so I had some folks here in Wyoming who were close with newly elected Governor Dave Friedenthal. And there was an opportunity where there was a position for the Director of Tourism open under Governor Friedenthal's administration. And fortunately, I was the one who was able to fill that role. And the rest is history, as they say.
Well, what has been some of the most challenging initiatives, or actually just some of the most challenging ways that you've had to think outside the box in terms of educating people about Wyoming?
Well, there's two different components for that. Internally in the state, I believe that there is a conversation about elevating the value of tourism as an industry and what it contributes to the state economically, qualitatively, just in how it boosts other industries. And externally, the conversation is really about what Wyoming is, that it is this beautiful, vast, wide open, rugged space, but yet very progressive, very independent. And I think there's a lot of misnomers. There's a lot of things that probably some perceptions are reality. But those are really in the two buckets. Statewide is just to continually impress upon residents and people who live and work in other industries that this industry too is very viable and a very necessary part of Wyoming's foundational economy.
Why is that? Why do you think that is?
Well, I not just think it, I know it. When you look at sales and use tax, yes, I know this. Like sales and use tax collections, and I mean, while I'm heading up a marketing entity, I'm dialed in quickly to Wyoming and what it means to live and work here. And the sales and use tax collection from the leisure and hospitality industry is substantial. In times when the energy industry has fallen, the leisure and hospitality sector is the second leading contributor to sales and use tax. And that's money that's going into not only the state of Wyoming's government, but into cities and towns and into county governments. That's money that visitors who are spending here are contributing to our local tax base. That allows those municipalities and local governments to invest those tax dollars into very necessary needs, whether it's from trash collection or police protection or building a road or a bridge. I mean, the visitor economy is very, very important.
When you were growing up in Gillette, were you the kind of family or kind of kid that stayed close to home, or did your family venture out around the state?
Well, my dad was a rancher, and then in those days, when you hit 8th grade, when my sister hit the 9th grade, there was no longer, you didn't go to country school, as they called it. So we moved to town, and so we didn't have the financial means to do a lot, but we did get out and go places. So growing up in Gillette, we spent a lot of time there. Going to the county fair and visiting friends and family. And then we ventured a lot into neighboring mountain areas. We spent a lot of time in the Bighorns, camping and enjoying that areas over even east of Sundance, along where Ranch A is located now, where Sand Creek is. Keyhole State Park was our lake that we went to growing up. And so we did spend a lot of time in that area. We would have family outings to Devil's Tower National Monument. But I also remember being a kid and going to Yellowstone National Park. My parents bought a camper that you fit in to a pickup, and it was one of those that had a bed that laid over the cab of the pickup.
Right.
So kids could lay up there and peer out. And I was probably only 6 or 7 years old, and I still really remember that trip. In fact, my sister and I were just talking about it the other day. And so while we didn't get to do a lot of trips, but we did get out. And then once I got into college, then I started meeting people from, all over the state. You become friends with people who live in, Big Piney or places that you'd never been, Cowley, Wyoming, or I hadn't been at that time. And so even in my college days, we would go and visit friends and all summer long on weekends and hang out with each other. They would come to Gillette. And so I had a pretty good exposure of Wyoming before I came back and took this job, but obviously it was not nearly as deep as what these experiences are, but I had a small foundation of it.
No, that's good. I mean, I think that's what I have found most intriguing about talking to people about Wyoming is that it's always been about wide open spaces and being outside and memories of camping and just, maybe even growing up on a ranch. That was just a part of life. And just how amazing it is that so many kids never experience the outdoors the way our kids in Wyoming get to experience the outdoors.
Yes, and I think there's a real thirst and a movement to get back to that. But certainly those of us who get to live and work in Wyoming, it's one of the greatest assets. Was a family that we worked with last summer. They're from California, and they were here in Wyoming. And we just did a beautiful story on them, a video story on them. And one of the lines in this video that the mother uses, she doesn't use it, she actually says it, and I've used it since then in describing it, but she said, and she has 4 kids, 2 of whom they have adopted and who have Down syndrome. And she says, Wyoming's landscape is every parent's dream. Here they can run and be free. And I just feel like that's so true. The barriers of life that sometimes constrict and confine us, when you're outside and you're in, whether it's a yard or a meadow, or you're in these beautiful wide open spaces, you don't have those kinds of restrictions. And I felt like, listening to her story with her family and the challenges that her 2 children have, that, she didn't feel those barriers here. She thought the possibilities were endless for what they could explore like every other child.
Oh, wow. I bet that probably made your heart feel really good to be able to.
I mean, it's such a sweet story. And while that one is compelling, there's so many people that live here, visitors that come here that have those kinds of experiences. And that's why there's something about this place. And I love the fact that we have a small population and that we are connected to one another, and that, in any of these situations, the heavy lifting isn't as heavy when we're all working toward the same goal.
Right.
And if that's growing the visitor economy in the world in which I work, then, I'm grateful for such a powerful and mighty industry.
Well, and it truly is, and I'm glad to hear you have real numbers for that, so people can feel good about that. So I want to talk about the fact that we're celebrating as Wyoming as the first state to give women the right to vote, and I know you're on the governor's council for the celebration of suffrage in Wyoming.
Yes, yes.
And how do you feel about the progress that women have made, and what do you think still needs to be done?
So, first of all, I want to just clarify as we think about suffrage and the celebration is that, Wyoming, first and foremost, the territorial government who passed that suffrage act was the first unconditional suffrage act that was ever passed. And by unconditional, we mean there were no restrictions. There were other suffrage acts that had been passed in other states or territories, but they had restrictions. Women had to be married, or they had to be, there's certain things that they had to meet. Wyoming didn't have any conditions on theirs. And so that was an important part of it. Also, that not only were women then, it was actually recognized their inherent right to vote, but they could also hold office. So those were two distinguishing components of the Suffrage Act. And then when they were debating the Wyoming Constitution, and when Wyoming was becoming a state, in fact, yesterday on Statehood Day, being in our beautifully restored Capitol in that original territorial house chamber where they debated the suffrage law, the Union did not want Wyoming to enter because of our intact suffrage component act that was going to be in the Wyoming Constitution. And those leaders then said, we will stay out rather than come without our women. And I'm paraphrasing that, but that was a really powerful piece of the Suffrage Act. Wyoming's Suffrage Act was never revoked. Other states and territories revoked their suffrage acts at some point during their historical back lens of this. Louisa Swain, who was the first woman to cast a vote in a general election under an unconditional suffrage act, cast that vote in Laramie, Wyoming on September 6th of 1890. And so this was, an important part for her. But I think it's important that we understand that these were not around us, not universal laws that were passed. I mean, just like today, as you make progress and you look at the history of great movements, it took a lot of time and effort before you got to that point of getting something that could actually get passed. And then you think, oh my goodness, we're here, but yet there's still so much work to be done ahead of you. And we all have an obligation to take that on to make it better. And so while Wyoming has, this unique place in history, and 50 years ahead of when the 19th Amendment was added to the U.S. Constitution, these men at that time were making these powerful decisions on behalf of women, but not for a moment without women behind them, because women have always done that. When men have been in power, they've offered up and had, fortunately, men who've been able to listen and move and do the right thing. And so today, when I think about where we've come, I think we've moved in great strides. But yet, is the work yet to be done? Yes, there's still so much work to be done. And we can't give up. As women, we still have to stay committed to, equality for all of us, for women and girls, but for any other underserved or perhaps isolated populations. I mean, this is about a greater good for humanity, and that's our obligation as people.
Well, and that's true. And I like what you said, the greater good for humanity. What are the ways that you feel that we can mentor young women?
Well, I think we need to obviously hire young women, meet with young women, raise good young women, hold young women accountable, and help them understand consequences and that life doesn't come with entitlements. But I think raising young women to be strong leaders, there's also this same equal obligation to raise good young men.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because we've always, if you want to just define it into, those two components, we've invested strongly in one half of our population, and that I'm painting with a broad brush on that. But that's what I don't want to do in any kind of elevation of women. I don't want to forget young men. We need to be educating and rearing these young future leaders as bodies of inclusion, and that there are strengths when you can utilize women who are coming up, and that we're going to get the best of all people when we have the greatest leaders, community volunteers, parents, teachers, coaches, tourism directors, whatever that is. I mean, we want the best out of humanity.
Right. Absolutely. And I was just thinking as you were talking, it was just coming into my mind that there are a lot of women that work in the tourism industry, not just in the administration, but also just in the service part of it.
Well, I think there's a lot of women who, this is a great industry for anyone who's seeking quick career advancement. And, there's a quick advancement from an entry-level position into mid-level management. A lot of opportunities for folks who have not pursued an advanced degree. But it's also a great industry for individuals who want to pursue an executive career. And the greatest thing about this industry is that it's a people-driven industry. So, you're teaching employees, whether they stay in this industry or they go somewhere else, really strong people interaction skills. But as far as there's a high ratio of women who are moving into executive positions in, general managers of hotels or companies, entrepreneurs, of women who are starting their own businesses to serve in this. It's a very friendly and inclusive industry, and women are certainly on a high career path. I was just looking at the roster of state tourism directors, and I think probably for the first time that since I've been in this role, it's more heavily weighted with women as state travel directors than men.
Are there any places in your industry that you see a discrepancy in gender roles?
Not really specifically in our industry or from my lens. Because it's such an inclusive industry, I don't know that I've ever felt that there was any bias for men over women or vice versa. But the other piece I would say on this is I haven't always worked on, like if you work, in a big convention center and you're on the sales side of things, maybe there was a time when that was more predominantly weighted with men, but that would be because in most sales positions in other industries, there was a time when that was heavily weighted with men. That is, changing today where women have really strong careers in sales.
Oh, yeah, that's for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, not in my experience, no. That's why maybe I have always felt so at home in this industry, too.
Well, it sounds like it. I mean, it seems like it's really a part of your personality to really enjoy being, you sound like a people person.
Well, I mean, we've known each other a long time, and as are you. You know what this industry is like. If you are willing to treat strangers like friends, and if you enjoy working with a broad spectrum of individuals, this really is a great industry. And it is, people take a vacation by choice. They're not forced to take a vacation. Okay, maybe if you're a teenager, you may be forced to go somewhere. But, and I mean, these are discretionary choices that Americans and international visitors choose to invest with their hard-earned money. And they want a memorable and special experience. And I'm no differently in that when I plan travel. And so to be able to be in the position of creating that kind of inspiration for people, like, think about Wyoming, look what you can do, and the types of experiences that you could have here. It's a good industry, and it's a good people industry, and I've loved it. I've been really fortunate to have this as my career.
Well, and you've been fortunate to be able to come home and do the thing that you love.
Oh, to be in Wyoming and taking the very best that this beautiful state has to offer and putting it out there for the rest of the world to see. It has really been such a blessing for me, and to be here with my family that are still, a lot of them still in and around the Gillette area in the northeast corner of Wyoming. Yeah, it's been a very special gift, and I've this industry. So many people in this industry. I have followed and learned from so many great leaders. And I just saw Clarine Law on Tuesday night.
Oh.
And, she's the matriarch of our industry.
Mm-hmm.
And I've learned from her, but I learned from Jean Bryan and others who've come before me in this role as a state tourism director, from stakeholders all across the state. And people are generous with their knowledge. And to me, I've just been really fortunate to have that.
Well, and you're really spoiled too.
I am. Don't tell anyone. But this may be true.
I know. But
I confess. I concede to that.
Well, it's been great talking to you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to First But Last, brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. Please join us again next week as we continue our conversations with women from around the state. You can also find us at thinkwy.org, where we continue the conversation on our blog about the history, journey, and the challenges of Wyoming's intrepid women living in the equality state. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show and leave us a review on iTunes. Thank you for listening.